Welcome, everyone. My name is Thomas Axe. I'm a senior fellow at the Harvard Kennedy School of Government, and this is the presentation to the CalVIP Executive Steering Committee on following the evidence, violence reduction strategies that are proven to work. It's a pleasure to be with you all today. First, a little bit about me. Before coming to the Harvard Kennedy School, I served as Deputy Secretary to Governor Andrew Cuomo in New York State, and you'll hear a little bit about my work there. Before that, I was Chief of Staff to the Office of Justice Programs at the U.S. Department of Justice under Barack Obama, and I've been working in criminal justice in one way or another for the vast majority of my career. So I'm going to jump into the substance of the presentation now. So we're going to begin with what works in reducing violence and giving you some general principles about how to address urban violence. And I should distinguish urban violence from other forms of violence. We're talking about the intersection of gang violence, gun violence, youth violence, street violence. We're not discussing other forms of violence such as police violence or domestic violence or other forms of violence. The principles that we're discussing are explored in depth in my book, Bleeding Out: The Devastating Consequences of Urban Violence and a Bold New Plan for Peace in the Streets. That book came out in June, and it's available in bookstores everywhere. The book summarizes the results of over 1,400 rigorous impact evaluations, meaning evaluations with quasi-experimental or experimental designs, but it also includes the results from over 50 semi-structured interviews of former offenders, gang members, service providers, faith-based leaders, and law enforcement. And the idea was to not only rigorously synthesize the results of all of the rigorous research around urban violence, but also to then put that urban violence in the results of that research in conversation with actual community members on the street. And what we found, which was somewhat surprising, is that there was a large amount of agreement on both what urban violence looks like and how to solve it. So now I'll discuss some of those principles. First, I want to just address the high price of urban violence. Over 15,000 Americans were killed last year, and over 1,700 Californians were killed as well. The cost of a single homicide is extraordinarily higher, anywhere from 10 to 19 million based on both direct and indirect costs. The direct costs are costs of the criminal justice system, the medical system, lost wages, and so on. But the indirect costs are even greater, maybe twice as high as the direct costs. And those capture all of the social costs of fear and avoidance of violent crime. And in particular, those costs of fear and avoidance are captured in property values, which research shows are suppressed by incidents of violent crime. Urban violence accounts for the vast majority of homicides, both in the United States and in California in particular. Just nationally, since 9/11, 400 people, more than 400 people have died in terrorist attacks and more than 500 in mass shootings. But at least 100,000 individuals have died due to urban violence. And so the scope and scale of this problem is massive, and its costs are extraordinary. And I should note that while we can measure these costs, the direct costs of the victims, their friends, and family are obviously unquantifiable. Now, to be successful in reducing violence, there are three principles that I will review with you. These principles are focus, balance, and fairness. Let's begin with focus. One of the most durable findings that we see in the literature concerning urban violence is that it's sticky, meaning that it clusters among a surprisingly small group of people, places, and behaviors. For instance, violence doesn't concentrate among classes of people, such as young men, but instead among surprisingly small networks of what some people call hot people. In Oakland, 60% of murders occurred within a small network containing 0.3% of the city's residents, approximately 400 people. And in New Orleans, 50% of killings occurred within a similar network of 600 to 700 people. And this finding is duplicated all across the country and, in fact, across the globe. The majority of violence doesn't just concentrate demographically, it concentrates geographically, in particular in hot spots. And these hot spots are not entire neighborhoods or census tracts. They're in fact smaller locations, a particular housing project, a particular corner, a particular block. And in most cities, 4% of geography accounts for 50% of crime, meaning 4% of these hotspots count for about half of the crime in a city. And serious violence crime, including homicide, is even more concentrated than that. And then finally, in addition to people and places, the majority of violence is facilitated by a few key behaviors such as illegal gun carrying that we'll discuss later. So, not surprisingly, if violence is a sticky problem, then we need a sticky solution in order to address it. And what we see all across the criminal justice field, from policing to gang prevention to reentry, is that interventions focusing on the highest risk people, places, and behaviors tend to generate the strongest effects. This isn't true just in criminal justice, it's also true in public health, with targeted secondary and tertiary prevention programs outperforming primary ones. And you can see some research here by Limbus et al. Looking at 15 randomized controlled trials with the tertiary interventions, meaning the most targeted interventions, outperforming the secondary and primary ones. Now, this principle of focus would be a concern if there were significant crime displacement, meaning that if we focused on crime on one block, it just moved down the street, or if we focused on a particular group of offenders, as soon as they were either deterred or prevented from committing violence, another group just took their place. But thankfully, over 30 years of research suggests that there is something sticky about both these people and these places, and the displacement effects, while they can exist, tend to be quite minor. So all of this evidence yields the first fundamental of violence reduction, which is if you want to be successful in stopping shootings and killings, you must be focused. In terms of the second principle, the principle of balance, all across the policy spectrum, when my colleague Chris Winship and I reviewed the evidence, we found support for both soft and tough approaches, meaning we found successful approaches that had a fairly aggressive enforcement-oriented approach to reducing violence, but we also saw successful approaches that had a strong prevention focus as well. And in fact, what the literature shows is that you need a balance of both. Punishment deters or removes the current offenders, while prevention can divert future offending. You need to combine the immediacy of punishment with the sustainability of prevention. And when you look across the country, there isn't a single example of a city that has simply arrested its way out of violence or alternatively programmed its way out of violence. So this evidence all yields the second fundamental of violence reduction. If you want to be successful in reducing violence, you must be balanced. Finally, we have the third principle of fairness. Emerging evidence indicates that legitimacy and safety are closely interconnected. And legitimacy doesn't depend just on procedural notions of fairness, but also substantive notions of effectiveness. And this is what we see in urban communities of color that are suffering from high rates of violence. People feel simultaneously overburdened by aggressive law enforcement measures, but also underprotected by law enforcement and the state. And so they feel that the state lacks legitimacy in both ways, and both are important. So it's important to resist false choices between the two. Now, what happens when communities don't believe in their criminal justice system? What happens is they withdraw, meaning that they refuse to provide information, serve as witnesses, or serve as jurors, or call 911. But perhaps most importantly, they refuse to use the criminal justice system to resolve disputes. And this leads to the cycles of urban violence that we see, the retaliatory cycles that we see so often. So that when someone has a dispute with someone, perhaps someone's nephew was beaten up, instead of calling 911 or involving the police, they involve their friends and affiliates. And a beating can lead to a shooting, which can lead to a killing, and so on and so on. Now, we know that when police and criminal justice officials work hard to be perceived as fair and to create fair processes, that they are transparent and neutral, they can slowly rebuild trust to improve compliance and promote collaboration. There's no panacea here. There's a lot of hard work that needs to be done. But overall, this evidence leads to the third fundamental of violence reduction, which is if we want to reduce violence, we have to be fair, meaning that our violence reduction efforts have to be perceived as fair by the impacted communities in which we're working. Now, in order to treat violence, we need a combination of people, place, and behavior-based strategies. As I said before, violence concentrates among people, places, and behaviors, so we need to organize our strategies accordingly. In terms of people-based strategies, we need to take the following 5 steps. We need to identify and engage those who are most at risk. We need to, once they are engaged, we need to stabilize them by providing safety and security. Once they are stabilized, we need to treat their misguided thinking, unsafe and healthy behavior, and trauma. And once treated, we need to offer then and only then education and employment opportunities. And finally, and unfortunately, for those who persist, we must punish them with swift and certain sanctions. What these steps summarize is a common misperception, which is that if we simply throw services or support to these highest risk individuals without getting them ready for those services or support, it often leads to failure. And what you see in the literature is that employment-only approaches to violence reduction tend not to work. The same is true with education only, arts only, sports only. Generally, what you need is a much more focused, much more robust approach to engage the highest individuals, meet them where they're at, deal with their hypervigilance, meaning their quickness to anger and their quickness to perceive threats, sometimes where they don't exist. And once those issues are addressed, then we can start offering opportunities. To do otherwise, unfortunately, we see that when we offer jobs to people without these steps, they often can't maintain those jobs, and the same thing is true with educational programs. So what are some examples of some programs that work? Cognitive behavioral therapy is perhaps the best approach in terms of turning around the lives of the highest risk individuals. A systematic review performed by Mark Lipsey and his colleagues identified 58 tests or evaluations in total, 19 of which were randomized controlled trials. And they had overall, they had a means odds ratio of 1.53, which means that those programs were 1.5 times less likely, that people in those programs were 1.5 times less likely to recidivate than people not in those programs. And in fact, that was the average effect. But for the strongest programs, they had an effect not of about 25% reduction in recidivism, but actually 50% reduction in recidivism. And that was 1 in 5 programs overall. Now, moving forward, it's absolutely critical to attend to the behavioral and cognitive issues of these high-risk populations. But we also have to incorporate trauma into the current CBT practice. We do have trauma-focused CBT for children, but unfortunately, we do not yet have it, or it hasn't been evaluated yet for adults. Another proven strategy is focused deterrence. Anthony Braga and his colleagues performed a systematic review identifying 24 studies in total, all of them which were quasi-experiments, and the vast majority of which generated noteworthy crime reduction effects. And in fact, for gang and group violence specifically, 12 out of 12 programs worked. And we see this in terms of the standardized mean difference, the overall impact or effect size of these programs. A moderate 3.8 0.383 effect size overall, but for gang and group violence, 0.657. This is the massive effect size, and it leads to outcomes in terms of reductions in shootings and killings of 40, 50, 60% over time. And so focused deterrence is actually the single strongest intervention in terms of reducing violence, according to the literature. That doesn't mean it works all the time. It doesn't mean that you should only do focused deterrence, and it certainly doesn't mean it's a panacea. However, it is the single strongest strategy. For street outreach, I've been summarizing the results of systematic reviews that synthesize the results of multiple studies, but currently there is no systematic review available for street outreach, although myself and several colleagues are working on one right now. Street outreach, which is the use of street, gang, or outreach workers to identify or address violent conflicts, has a mixed but promising record of success. When it's done well, it reduces crime and violence, but unfortunately, when it's not done well, it either has no effects or it can even increase crime and violence. So it's very important when implementing a street work program to do it in a rigorous and well-supported way. Hospital-based outreach efforts have similarly mixed results. The record on both of these interventions, which are quite similar, is I would characterize it as promising, but not yet proven. And in order to move these programs into the proven category, they need to be further professionalized, much like they are in Los Angeles with the use of the GRID program and the Street Outreach Academy, systematized and connected to broader anti-violence efforts. For instance, street outreach works best when it is acting as an ambassador between people who are severely disconnected from the state and from the community and reconnecting them, not just serving as an intermediary between them and law enforcement, but also serving as an intermediary between them and all of the social services that could be offered to these individuals, but are often unable to reach them. And so it's important to make these strategies not an alternative to traditional strategies, but a complement to them. We've been discussing people-based strategies. Now let's move on to place-based strategies. In micro-locations known as hotspots, where the vast majority of violence is taking place, the following three steps work best. First, you need to institute some form of hotspots policing, meaning policing that concentrates its patrols in those hotspots, but you have to follow up that policing with placemaking and community building. We know a lot about hotspots policing. Anthony Braga, again, has performed one of several systematic reviews, and after studying over 25 evaluations, the vast majority had noteworthy positive effects. But it's important to note that the standardized mean difference, the effect size, is much smaller than it was with focused deterrence, meaning that while hotspots policing works, it doesn't have a massive effect. And in fact, another Braga review showed a significant distinction between different types of policing programs. Aggressive, indiscriminate, zero-tolerance policing approaches tended to generate tremendous community resistance and were not actually that effective in reducing crime and violence, while community and problem-oriented hotspots policing approaches, which were much more targeted and limited in nature, were both better received by the community members and were also more effective in reducing crime and violence. So in terms of hotspots policing, the takeaway is that there's a right way and a wrong way to do it. Now, in terms of following up your policing with placemaking efforts, the strongest evidence, although it doesn't have the strongest evidence base, is for removing blight through urban greening efforts to address and ameliorate vacant yards and abandoned houses and things like that. And also restoring services such as street lighting and trash removal. All of these things to sort of try to transform the physical nature of these hotspots so that you don't have to keep inundating them with law enforcement. That said, we have to note that there is surprisingly weak evidence in support of the broader CPTED approaches to crime prevention, meaning crime prevention through environmental design. So for decades, we have been investing millions, if not billions, in these approaches to change the built or physical environment of areas in order to deter crime. And at best, we see only weak or modest results. That's not an argument for not doing these things, but it is an argument for not placing all your eggs in the sort of placemaking basket and making sure that your placemaking efforts are cost effective. For instance, many urban greening efforts are extremely affordable in terms of requiring only hundreds of dollars per hotspot in order to address the blight that you see. So even if they don't have massive effects, they may be worthwhile because they're so affordable. Then finally, we need to support the policing and placemaking with community building. One of the unfortunate things about the term community is that it's hopelessly abstract. It means too many things to dip too many people. And so you see a lot of confusion in both the community-based crime prevention area and the community-based policing area. Nobody knows what it means because it means different things to different people. And so what I'm proposing is that we redefine community in a much more concrete and targeted way to mean partnerships in and around hotspots, including but not limited to police, supported by procedural justice strategies, basically meaning a partnership-oriented violence prevention strategy. We've seen support for these efforts, sometimes called third-party policing efforts, in the literature, and they should be expanded. The idea is that consistent with this principle of focus, we need to stop treating the entire community for violence. We need to focus just on these violent micro-locations known as hotspots. Turning finally to the behavior-based strategies, we need to look at these issues that we generally view broadly: guns, gangs, and drugs. We tend to view these in absolute terms. But in this context, urban violence, it's best to think of them as behaviors that facilitate violence, meaning gun carrying, gang banging, and violent drug dealing. In order to maximize efficiency, we need to identify strategies that focus on these behaviors among people in hot spots. So what do I mean? What I mean is we shouldn't be focused for the purposes of urban violence on all guns, but instead on guns carried by hot people in hot spots. The same thing is true of drug dealing. For the purposes of urban violence, we're not focused on all drugs. We're focused on violent drug dealing by hot people in hot spots, and so on and so forth. So what do we know about gun violence? We know that, in fact, we don't have one type of gun violence in the United States. We have many, and there are at least 4 categories of gun violence: urban violence, domestic violence, mass shootings, and suicides. And there are no one-size-fits-all solutions to these. Mass shootings tend to dominate the public debate, but they account for less than 2% of all gun deaths. And they tend to drive the debate in terms of devoting most attention to supply-side solutions. But in terms of urban violence, the strongest evidence is for reducing demand. And what do I mean by that? I mean reducing the demand for guns among hot people, again, in hot spots. Chris Koper and his colleague performed a systematic review, looked at 4 studies, although there were no randomized controlled trials, of focused gun patrols and found them successful. And focused deterrence and street outreach, which we previously discussed, are also successful in targeting gun carrying. So not only, similar to guns, we should not focus on gangs generally, but on gang violence. And here you have a quote from Connie Rice, who is a civil rights activist in Los Angeles who has been working on these issues for decades. When we look at the gang research field, there are a lot of challenges. We don't know what a gang is. We don't know how many gang members there are, how many gang crimes or gangs generally there are. We don't know how to prevent gang membership or how to reduce gang crime. And ultimately, I think we need to move away from this focus on gangs, and we need to, instead of focus on gang identity, focus on group behaviors. First of all, outside of some areas on the West Coast, in California in particular, gangs are not as highly structured as many people believe them to be. And in many places, they are actually much more decentralized, sort of cliques, sets, groups, or networks, and less extremely hierarchical gangs. And when focusing on these groups of individuals, we need to address their behaviors using strategies such as focused deterrence and street outreach, meaning a nonviolent gang member is not an issue for us in terms of urban violence. Maybe they should be addressed through other programs, but they are simply not our top priority. And there is a massive disparity or diversity among gangs and gang members. Approximately 10% of all gang members are what are known as shooters, meaning individuals who are most likely to pick up a gun when that group has a conflict. And so we need to distinguish between the shooters or shot callers and the other people in the gang who might, sell the other members of the gang narcotics, or just like to hang out at the parties, or more minor members. And when we're talking about broader prevention-based efforts, we need to reject these gang-specific strategies in favor of the stronger evidence that we have for preventing juvenile delinquency overall. And instead of treating young gang members as gang members specifically, let's use the evidence we have on preventing crime and delinquency among young people generally. Again, not guns, but gun violence, not gangs, but gang violence, not drugs, but drug violence. So in many cities, urban violence used to be closely associated with drugs, and anyone who lived through the crack cocaine wars in the late 80s and early 90s is familiar with this. But today, much of the drug activity is increasingly disconnected from urban violence. And you can compare crack cocaine with the opioid epidemic happening now. So to reduce violence, we need to focus on violent drug conflicts, not on drug selling or abuse generally. For one thing, there's a strong replacement effect with drug enforcement, meaning that if you incarcerate drug dealers, other drug dealers will come to take their place. And in fact, we see that sometimes aggressive drug enforcement, by destabilizing drug markets, can actually increase competition and therefore violence. Also, we know that high-quality drug treatment is effective, and so for those individuals who are abusing drugs, high-quality drug treatment can be the answer. Also, it's not just about drugs; it's also about alcohol. More crimes are committed under the influence of alcohol than all illegal drugs combined, and so we need to pay attention to reducing alcohol abuse among those hot people in those hot spots as well. Moving forward, I just want to note that the strategies that I've articulated today don't need new laws, they don't need big budgets, and they don't even depend on widespread institutional reform. They can all be done right now. So what's missing? What's missing is a relatively small amount of money properly spent on a small set of programmatic efforts that are collectively focused, balanced, and fair. Now, I'm not talking about funding one strategy or even two. I'm talking about combining people, place, and behavior-based efforts into a coordinated effort. Now, how can that effort be organized? Well, we're going to need some means of doing so, and I propose using a framework adapted from public safety and public health models. Here's a sample framework that I created for the book Bleeding Out. It's empty here, but you can see along the top that we have the areas of prevention, intervention, and enforcement. And along the left side, we have the framework of people, places, and behaviors. And now you can see this framework populated with all of the strategies that are discussed in the book. I'm not suggesting that every jurisdiction should use every one of these, but you should try to have efforts that collectively, as I said, are focused, balanced, and fair. Now I want to talk about a specific statewide approach to integrating all of these principles, and it's about the GIVE initiative, which stands for Gun Involved Violence Elimination. And this is an initiative that I started as Deputy Secretary of Public Safety in New York State with the support of Governor Andrew Cuomo. The program has been highlighted and celebrated in a report by the Giffords Law Center, PICO, and the CJRC. So you can look that up there. And it is, as was said in the report, it is a unique state-level approach because it was so focused on reducing gun violence exclusively. How did it work? Under GIVE, counties were required to prepare annual plans that incorporated 3 core elements. They had to incorporate focus, meaning they had to focus their strategies on people and places driving the majority of gun violence. They had to align their efforts with non-GIVE resources in order to maintain a cohesive effort. We didn't want people working at cross purposes. And then finally, they had to engage stakeholders, particularly community members, to ensure sufficient backing and support. Everyone involved in the GIVE effort received procedural justice training, for one thing. In addition, counties had to incorporate at least 2 strategies from a limited menu of evidence-based strategies. Some of these were hotspots policing, CPTED, focused deterrence and street outreach, among others. And they had to, as I said, integrate the principles of procedural fairness into everything they did. Now, they didn't just receive funding, but counties also had the benefit of a statewide network that hosted meetings, webinars, and calls, and essentially served as an effort to socialize all of the strategies and values of GIVE and to collectively, slowly sort of raise the criminal justice violence reduction IQ in the state. GIVE also provided training and technical assistance to counties from nationally recognized efforts, and we also coordinated the efforts of relevant state agencies, so having the state police, parole, and others all working to support the local efforts to reduce gun violence. Now, I want to talk about CalVIP and give you some of my initial thoughts on how the program might be established. And a lot of these are based on my experiences both in reviewing the rigorous research and in my practical experiences in establishing GIVE and also national efforts under the Obama administration. So first, I just want to talk about this current challenges. CalVIP is doing a good job, but it isn't sufficiently targeted to urban violence and especially to high-risk populations that are driving that violence. It's also not sufficiently evidence-based, meaning depending on rigorous evidence of effectiveness. And importantly, it's not sufficiently encouraging coordinated citywide approaches, aligning the efforts of police officers, prosecutors, street outreach workers, public health officials, and others, and community members, getting them to all row in the same direction in order to achieve results. So AB 1603 was recently signed by the governor, and I think it presents a huge opportunity to address some of these challenges and to infuse localities with evidence and community-informed approaches. And here's some of my initial thoughts just reviewing the AB 1603 language. And you'll see that many of these comments are in relation to being able to set up a successful statewide program like GIVE. So you can see in subsection B of AB 1603 that the purpose of CalVIP is to improve public health and safety by supporting effective violence reduction initiatives, so on and so forth. And it notes that they are particularly focused on homicides, shootings, and aggravated assaults. And I think this needs to be recognized as the goal. This is critical. CalVIP is focused on stopping killings, shootings, and beatings in that order. And everything about the way the program is set up and administered needs to insist on remaining focused on these outcomes alone. Anti-violence efforts fail when they drift, when they become anti-poverty efforts or generalized anti-crime efforts. So you have to do everything you can to keep that focus on the violence itself. In subsection C, it says that CalVIP grants shall be used to support evidence-based violence reduction initiatives, including without limitation, I underlined that, hospital-based violence intervention programs, street outreach programs, and focused deterrence. Now, I want to point out that these are all crucial strategies, and they should be supported, but you don't have to necessarily limit applicants to just those strategies. As I noted, the statute says without limitation. It doesn't require that you fund only these applications. And in fact, you shouldn't, because while you're singling out a number of strong people-based approaches, there's no mention of any place-based or behavior-based approaches. And so I think you want to leave the door open for other evidence-informed approaches. I also think you need to define evidence-based or evidence-informed more carefully. It shouldn't mean that someone can simply say, here's one study or here's one report that tells us that what we're doing is effective. I think you need to define in very specific terms what evidence means. And I think it should mean something to the effect that evidence-based means supported by multiple high-quality causal impact evaluations. Causal impact evaluations are different from observational impact evaluations in that they can identify a causal impact, a before, after, if, then impact on violence and crime. Also in subsection C, it says that these initiatives shall be focused on high-risk populations. I think it's critical, similar to the focus on violence itself, to insist that applicants demonstrate that they are focusing only on those at the highest risk for killings and shootings and beatings. In subsection D, it says that CalVIP grants should be made competitively to cities and community-based organizations. Now, the statute says that they can be made to both cities and community-based organizations, but I believe that cities are in fact best positioned to achieve the goals of the statute, both in terms of handling day-to-day implementation of these efforts as set out in subsection F2, coordinating, especially with regard to coordinating existing programs, other existing programs that's mentioned in F3, avoiding mass incarceration, which is mentioned in section G, and to meet the in-kind contribution in subsection H2I. So while the statute allows both, I think that there should be a preference for cities as grantees. Also, you can allow cities to meet the matching contribution in subsection I with an in-kind dedication of city services, including law enforcement. There's no violation of subsection J2 here, and we want to incentivize multi-sector collaboration in localities. While this CalVIP statute specifically says no money can go to law enforcement actors, you want them at the policy-making table in order to have an approach that is not just focused but also balanced and fair. And so using this matching contribution through cities is a way to make sure that you get law enforcement at the table and participating. I also want to point out that there's no definition of quote-unquote competitive basis, and that the length of the grant cycle in the statute can be determined by the board. So one possible way to address this is this creates an opportunity to simplify your grant making, and it gives you some flexibility. And so you could, if you wanted to, simplify your grant-making process by awarding funds once based largely on the criteria set out in subsection E, meaning the rates of violence, and then adjusting that amount competitively each year based on fidelity to the CalVIP criteria, meaning emphasis on evidence-based strategies and high-risk individuals. The reason I like this approach is because it simplifies the grant-making process and it provides the right balance of continuity and accountability. In order to incentivize that long-term collaboration and planning, you need to give people assurances that they're going to receive funding every year. On the other hand, you need to ensure accountability and performance. And one of the things that was very effective for the GIVE program was that we were funding through a formula program that was then competitively adjusted up or down. So the counties knew that if they were drifting and not performing well, that in the following year their funds would be adjusted downward, and that the difference would be given to another locality. And that really served to sort of sharpen the incentives. Now, in subsection L, I'm going to finish up here. It says that the board may use up to 5% of the total funding each year for the cost of administering the program. I would strongly recommend that you use these funds to set up a statewide peer-to-peer network, as we did with GIVE, and to engage a serious research partner for evaluation, analysis, and technical assistance. It's absolutely critical to make sure that you are creating a community among your grantees and applicants where they can learn from one another, and where you can target training and technical assistance, and where you can actually have some interesting sort of social incentives to outperform one another and to look good in the eyes of their peers. In terms of the research partners, it's absolutely essential that you engage them early, get them in working with you as you start developing this program, so that they can do the best evaluation possible. In addition to providing a rigorous external and independent evaluation, they can also help you with data analysis, and they can also provide technical assistance. So through the course of this presentation, I've given you some of what the evidence discusses in terms of what works in urban violence reduction. I've talked about one successful state program, and I've talked about how CalVIP might benefit from the lessons both of the rigorous research and of some practical experience at the state level. I hope this presentation has been helpful, and I look forward to answering your questions. Thank you very much.